Today I'm going to talk about global lake responses to climate change, and I'll jump straight into the first slide. And this kind of summarizes the motivation for my research. So as we all know, the world is warming. And this visual basically just summarizes by how much the world has warmed since 1850. So between 1850 and the near present. This is a temperature anomaly figure for the entire Earth. So it represents for each year how much warmer or cooler is the world relative to the 1961 to 2010 baseline. And as you can see, in the recent few decades, we are experiencing unprecedented warmth, and specifically over the past few years, the world is now in excess of 1 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial period. So like I said, this summarizes kind of the motivation for my work, and I basically try and understand how lakes around the world respond to this warming. So with global warming in mind, how do lakes respond? So to do this, me and my group, we use evidence from various observational platforms, various data sources and so on. Some of them are summarized in this figure here. So most of our work in recent years comes from analyzing satellite data, so thermal images taken from space, as well as other types of images which tell us something about how lakes are warming, how the quantity of water is varying, and how the water quality is changing in response to climatic shifts. In addition to looking at satellite data, we also use data from drones, UAVs, from point measurements. So point measurements include things such as measurements that are taken from a single point in a lake through time. These are the long-term records that we have in some lakes extending over 100 years. So these really give us a detailed view of how lakes have not just responded over this rapid warming period, but also responded at the start of the 20th century till the present. We also use data from thermistor chains. So these give us a detailed view of how lakes are changing, not just at the surface, but deeper down into the water column. Obviously, satellites give us a detailed picture of the surface itself, but these thermistor chains give us an accurate view of what's happening below the water surface. Less frequently, but also as important, we use data from profilers and AUVs. So this slide just summarizes some of the data sources, which underpins some of the results that I will show later on in the presentation. So most of our work focuses around understanding the thermal structure of lakes, specifically the energy budget of lakes, so how much heat or energy is entering the water body and how much energy or heat is escaping. This is summarized in the schematic diagram showing both at the surface the energy fluxes, but also deeper down below, covering things such as the thermal structure, so how lakes are categorized into distinct thermal layers. So most of you will be aware of the different layers that we have in lakes, including the epilimnion, which is the surface layer, the metalimnion, which is this transitional layer where the thermocline sits, and the hypolimnion, which is the deeper layer of the water column. Now, what we try and do is understand, firstly, how these energy fluxes, how these changes in incoming shortwave, longwave, and turbulent heat fluxes change through time, and what are the consequences of those changes on one, the lake surface temperature, and the thermal profiles below. So we focus on stratification patterns, so the timing, the duration, and the intensity of stratification in lakes, the occurrence of extremes in surface temperature, changes in ice cover patterns, and as well looking at mixing dynamics. So given that the amount of data that we have at the surface far exceeds that we have deeper down, a lot of our research, especially in recent years, has focused at the surface layer. But I'll cover each of these points as we move through the presentation. So as well as using different data sources, we also use different modeling approaches, and these vary from somewhat simple statistical models to very complex machine learning and process-based approaches. So I've tried to summarize this in the slide. On the right-hand side, you see this figure, which demonstrates a different type of modeling approaches. We have classical statistical models. So these can be anything in terms of one input equals an output in a statistical sense, to more complex machine learning, which try to learn patterns from data to forecast the future, forecast back in time, or basically just to fill data gaps. And then towards deep learning, which require a vast amount of data to understand how lakes are responding. In terms of process-based models, we typically use what we call one-dimensional lake models. So one-dimensional lake models are relatively simple to run, and the computational time is not too long. So these one-dimensional models basically try to condense the complexity of a lake into a single point. So it gives you average conditions of a lake through time. And these are perfect for simulating long-term climatic change-induced responses in lakes. When we're focusing on very detailed patterns in individual lakes, we then turn to using two-dimensional or three-dimensional models, which require vast amounts of information, not only to characterize the lake, but also to predict them. And when we are very ambitious and try to extend further, we use a combination of both process-based and machine learning approaches. So these are called hybrid models or process-guided deep learning models. And process-guided deep learning models basically try to combine the strengths of both machine learning and process-based models. So this is just to give you some sort of overview of the type of modeling approaches that we use in our forecasting work. And some of these will be described briefly later on in the presentation when I talk about specific simulations from our work. Okay, so that was a brief summary of the data and the modeling approaches that we use. Now I'm going to turn our attention to what does the research show in terms of how lakes are responding to climate change. So much of our work, as I said, revolves around lake temperature simulations, but it seems logical to start during the winter season when lakes are ice covered. So for many lakes throughout the Northern Hemisphere, they are ice covered for several months during the year. And whatever happens during this winter season has a knock-on effect on what happens at other times. So the work that we've been doing looking at ice cover changes directly looks at how the timing of ice cover, so when does ice start, when does it finish, subsequently what is the duration of ice cover in lakes, and how different lakes respond to climate change in this context. Some of the key simulations that we've done in this topic has tried to understand how lakes freeze and the timing of those freeze events in lakes throughout the Northern Hemisphere. So this is a figure that was taken from a paper that was led by Professor Sapna Sharma back in 2019. And what you can see on the right-hand side is, this is a global map of the Northern Hemisphere looking from above. It shows two colors. One is an orange color, which represents lakes that don't freeze every winter. So these lakes freeze sometimes, but don't freeze every year. And then the blue kind of green color represents lakes that freeze every winter under current climatic conditions. So these freeze without fail every year. So one of the things that we did as part of this study was trying to simulate how this map changes by the end of the century. And basically to understand how the number of lakes worldwide that freeze or don't freeze changes under different climate scenarios. So in this slide, you'll see an image which changes with different degrees of global warming. So the first one demonstrates current conditions, which I talked about in the previous slide. And then the image kind of transitions between different levels of global warming, going from 2 to 3.2 to 4.5 to 8 degrees. And what you can see through each image as global warming intensifies is the increase in this orangey color throughout the Northern Hemisphere. Now, what this represents is with each level of additional warming, the number of lakes worldwide that no longer freeze every winter is increasing. So again, orange represents those lakes that don't freeze every year. So you can see as the image goes through, the concentration of those orange points increases. Now, as I mentioned, whatever happens during the winter season, so during the ice cover period, has a knock-on effect on what happens at other times of the year. So the day of year in which lakes lose their ice cover has a direct impact on the temperature of lakes during the non-ice covered season. So water temperature in spring, water temperature in summer, and so on. So a lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to understand how lakes have warmed or not in response to climate change. And this is what's shown on the slide here. So this is some work that was led by a postdoc named Yan Tong. And it shows the lake surface water temperature trend of every lake in this study worldwide. So in this study, we used a combination of satellite observations and process-based one-dimensional lake modeling to simulate how lake temperatures in each of these lakes, 92,000 lakes worldwide, have changed since the 1980s. Temperature obviously governs the kinds of organisms that can live in lakes, where aquatic species all have preferred temperature ranges. So as the thermal environment, the surface temperature of lakes changes, the species that can live in those lakes also changes. Specifically, as temperatures go too far above a preferred range for a species, the number of individuals of that species can decrease in some cases critically. Now, the results that are shown on this slide in panels A, B, and C are part of a data set which we called GLAST, G-L-A-S-T, which is the Global Lake Surface Temperature Data Set. It's publicly available, and like I said, it's simulations from 1980 till the near present for 92,000 lakes worldwide, and it's freely available on Zenodo. Using this data set, we calculated that lakes worldwide have warmed at a rate of about 0.24 degrees Celsius per decade. This is twice as fast as the global oceans, how much they've warmed over the same period, and in line, albeit slightly cooler than changes in air temperature. We can also see that lakes are warming faster in the northern hemisphere, specifically above 60 degrees north, and then cooling less as we move further south. So this demonstrates the changes in lake surface temperature from 1980 till the near present, but using the same methodology, so using the same satellite data to calibrate a lake model, and then same lake model as used here, we try to predict how these things will change in the future. And this is shown on the left-hand side of this figure. So you'll all probably be aware of RCPs. So RCPs stand for representative concentration pathways, and these basically show different global warming scenarios, so greenhouse gas scenarios. RCP 2.6 is a low greenhouse gas scenario, RCP 6.0 is a medium high, and then 8.5 is a very high greenhouse gas emission scenario. So the left-hand figure here demonstrates projected changes in lake surface temperatures worldwide from 1980 till the year 2100, both historically, so in black, and then the different colors represent the future. Similar to the figure that I showed on the first couple of slides of the global temperature map, the lake surface temperatures here are shown as anomalies. So this is basically the difference between any given year and the historic period. So if the future period is positive, it means it's that much warmer than the historic period. So what we can see here is using RCP 8.5 as an example. By the year 2100, lakes globally will be almost 5 degrees warmer than they are today. So as well as looking at mean changes in lake surface temperature, so how the mean state changes both historically and into the future, we also defined a metric which we called lake heat waves. So lake heat waves are similar to atmospheric heat waves or marine heat waves. They're periods of extreme surface water temperature in lakes. Now, heat waves in lakes are defined as when the surface temperature exceeds the 90th percentile during the historical baseline for a sustained period of time, 5 days or longer. This is shown in panels A and B here. So in panel A, we have a probability distribution. The 90th percentile is shown on the right-hand side. So when temperatures in lakes exceed that 90th percentile for 5 days, they're defined as a lake heat wave. On the left-hand side, I just show some examples of lake heat waves in a lake in the UK, going from the year 2000 till the near present. And you can see this gradual increase in the number of heat wave days during that relatively short time period. So using the same GLAST data set, so this global data set of 92,000 lakes, we calculated how lake heat waves have changed historically since 1980 till the near present. This forms part of a review article that we recently published on extreme and compound events in lakes. And some of the figures here are taken directly from that paper. So on the left-hand side, panel A is the primary drivers of lake heat waves. So it responds to things such as the amount of incoming radiation, the amount of wind speed that lake is exposed to, as well as the magnitude and duration of thermal stratification. On the right-hand side, so panels B, C, and D, this shows the trends, so the rate of change in panel B, the average intensity of lake heat waves, C, the average duration of lake heat waves, and then panel D, the total duration per year of lake heat waves. So the average intensity is basically how warm are these lake surface heat waves, so how far above the baseline period will heat waves be. C is the average duration. So say if we have 10 different heat waves in a year, it's the average duration across all those events. And then D is the total, so the sum of all the individual heat wave days in a year. What you can see in each of these three figures is the dominance of the red color, which in each example represents an increase in trend. So the rate of change is increasing. So some of the summary statistics are that since the 1980s, lake heat waves have increased in average intensity by about 0.15 degrees over that short time period. The average duration has increased by about 2.1 days per decade, and the total duration by about 7 days per decade. So globally, each of these metrics have increased since the 1980s till the near present. Okay, so the top panels here from A to B basically just re-emphasize what I described in the previous figure, but now demonstrated as a time series format. So from the 1980s till the near present, showing the changes in the number of days, the average duration, average intensity, as well as the cumulative intensity of heat waves. So you can see the gradual and long-term trend here in each of those surface heat wave metrics. So one of the other things that we've defined and calculated is what we call the number of no escape events in lakes. So lake heat waves, again, are periods where surface water temperatures reach extreme levels. Okay, so they exceed the 90th percentile for a sustained period. A no escape event is where deeper water, which is typically cooler, has also increased. So there's no escape for surface species at deeper water. So a no escape event is basically that there's nowhere else in the water column that a species can escape that thermal stress. Okay. And what we find is that from the 1980s to the near present, the number of those no escape events are increasing. So I'm looking here at panel E, which is the second down on the left-hand side. So again, no escape events means that there's nowhere in the lake that water temperature is lower than the surface heat wave conditions. In panel I, so this is the bottom left, I show an escape depth. What this refers to is if there is an escape in terms of thermal anomaly, so if there is anywhere in the lake that's cooler than the surface heat wave conditions, we calculate an escape depth. So how far do species need to travel vertically in a water column to escape a lake surface heat wave? And what this shows is that the escape depth is increasing over this study period, meaning that species that live at the surface of a lake have to move deeper down further into the water column to escape a thermal stress. Related to these surface heat waves and the thermal anomalies below the lake surface, we also recently defined a new metric which we call lake subsurface heat waves. So these are periods in which lake bottom temperature anomalies exceed a historic extreme baseline Okay, so I won't go into the details of this too much, just in the space of time, but what panels A, B, C, and D demonstrate here is the temperature profile or the heat wave profile in terms of the number of days of subsurface heat waves, the average duration of subsurface heat waves, average intensity, and cumulative intensity. So these are very similar to a lake temperature profile plot, if you've seen these before, where you have warm surface conditions and cooler temperatures at depth. But these profiles here represent changes in heat waves going from the surface, which is the top of the y-axis, to the deeper regions, which is at the bottom. Okay. Some of the key metrics or key results that we found from this work is that the number of days of lake surface, of lake heat waves, actually increases as you move down into the water column. So panel A here demonstrates that the number of days of lake heat waves is low at the surface and then increases with depth. The same pattern can be seen in the average duration of heat waves, and then the opposite is seen in the intensity. So for lake heat wave intensity, we find that they are more intense at the surface and then less intense in deeper water. And then finally, in terms of lake heat waves, we also define something that we call concurrent or compounding lake heat waves. So these are periods in which lake heat waves occur both at the surface of a lake and in deeper regions. So basically, we have extreme water temperatures throughout the water column. So extreme temperatures at the surface and at depth at the same time. What we find is that the number of compounding lake heat waves, i.e. where they're occurring at the surface and at depth, have increased since the 1980s. And this is shown here on panel B on the top right. So you see this long-term increase in the number of compound surface and bottom heat waves. We also looked at these into the future. So compared the historic duration or the number of days of concurrent surface and bottom heat waves shown in panel A to the future shown in panel C. So panel C represents how many more days of compound heat waves will different lakes around the world experience by the end of this century relative to today. And you can see here in panel C again, the dark red colors in, for example, tropical regions and low latitude regions, meaning that those parts of the world will experience the greatest increase in concurrent surface and bottom heat waves. Okay, so focused solely on the surface and lake temperatures and heat wave characteristics up until now. So I'm going to slightly change focus now to talk about stratification, because whatever happens at the lake surface and whatever happens to water temperature has on thermal stratification. So I mentioned this briefly earlier. So stratification is this vertical layering of the water column. We have an epilimnion at the surface, hyperlimnion at depth, and then a thermocline separating them. This figure demonstrates a typical seasonal cycle of water temperature in a monomictic, dimictic lake in the Northern Hemisphere. So the colors represent temperature going from 0 in winter to 30 at the surface in summer. Y-axis is the depth, and then x-axis is the time of year. Now, changes in stratification are influenced by water temperature, which are influenced in turn by solar radiation, air temperature, wind, precipitation, among other things. So any changes in these driver data will have a direct impact on stratification. What we've been trying to do is understand how these change in response to global warming. So schematically, we can look at the impact of climate change on lake stratification by looking at 3 distinct periods. So the past is shown in the top panel, the present is shown in the middle panel, and the future is shown in the bottom. So again, these are temperature profile plots for the same lake in the 3 climate change periods: past, present, and future. These are outputs from one-dimensional lake model. And the key thing that I want to draw your attention to is how the duration of thermal stratification, which is highlighted here with the dashed black boxes, is increasing from one time period to the next. So this is an example of changes in stratification in one lake from our models. But what we've also done is applied this to thousands of lakes from around the world, again, using a one-dimensional modeling approach. And summarizing those future simulations across lakes globally results in this figure. So here I show changes in the different climate change scenarios, again, going from RCP 2.6 to 8.5, changes in the stratification onset, again, shown in anomaly, difference relative to the baseline period, and stratification breakup anomaly. We can see differences between the historical period in black and the different colors that follow. But some of the summary statistics from this analysis, again, this is a global analysis of stratification pattern changes. Some of the summary statistics are that stratification will begin about 22 days earlier on average and end about 11 days later by the end of this century, according to our model simulations. And due to these changes in what we call stratification phenology, which is start and end, the duration of stratification will increase by about 33 days on average by 2070 to 2099, so by the end of this century. So an extra 1 month globally of stratification in lakes worldwide. So the changes that I've described for lake ice loss, surface temperature, and stratification change have direct impacts on the amount of water in lakes via their impact on lake evaporation rates. So this schematic here tries to demonstrate the differences between the historic and future period. So in the historic period, we have an ice-covered winter period, followed by a summer stratified season in spring, summer, and autumn. In the future, as lakes lose that period of ice cover in winter and stratification starts earlier and lasts longer, hence an increase in the duration of summer stratification, what we're expecting is a considerable increase in the rates of evaporation in lakes. So in the future, due to these changes in ice stratification and warming, we expect lake evaporation rates to increase. So one of my PhD students, Sofia Lafuente, did a global analysis of changes in evaporation rates in lakes around the world. For this, use a multi-model ensembling approach, and this is shown here on the slide, where each row represents a different GCM. So GCM is a general circulation model. It's basically a climate model. And every column represents a lake model. So the lake models used here were ALBM, Simstrat, and Bic Lake. The colors in each of these maps represent the change in evaporation between today and the future. So we don't need to look at the specific details of each of these maps, but what we can see is that they all agree in the direction of change, meaning that the change in evaporation will increase across lakes worldwide, the magnitude of which will differ based on the lake model and the GCM used. But globally, lake evaporation will increase according to these future projections. The key statistics are that there'll be an up to 27% global increase this century in lake evaporation under RCP 8.5. Shown in a time series format, this here shows the latent heat flux anomaly, which is a substitute here for lake evaporation rates. So going from 1980 to 2100. And again, we see the changes in RCP 2.6, 6.0, and 8.5, each of which under RCP 8.5 showing this near linear increase in lake evaporation this century. Okay, obviously what this means is if we have an increase in evaporation rates or increase in the latent heat flux in lakes, the amount of water in the lakes, unless it's directly replenished by precipitation, will dry up. Here's an example. These are pictures given by Professor John Small, who does much of his work in the Canadian Arctic. On the left-hand side is a picture of a pond in the high Arctic on August 1987, and then the right-hand side is the same site from July 2006. So you can see due to increasing in evaporation and less input of precipitation in this region, this pond lake has dried up entirely. Obviously, this isn't happening everywhere. So one of the things that we expect as I explained in the previous slides, due to climate change, is that lakes will dry up due to an increase in evaporation. But in some parts of the world, such as the Tibetan Plateau, so this Himalayan region, lakes are actually expanding. So different to what we expect due to increased evaporation rates. Now, in this part of the world, you can see many glaciers in the background of the figure on the left-hand side. So as those glaciers melt, so increased air temperature means that glaciers melt, that glacial meltwater then flows into lakes in the region, causing their surface area to increase. So unlike the patterns that we see in lower altitude regions of lake drying, in this part of the world, lakes are actually expanding. And you can see this on the right-hand side in this GIF showing a time series of different images of lake surface area. What this means is that different parts of the world experience variable conditions in terms of climate change responses, in terms of water storage and water availability. So some parts of the world experience an increase in lake surface area, such as the high mountain regions that are fed by glaciers, and other regions, low-lying areas, which are particularly endorheic, for example, are drying up. So in brief, some lakes are expanding whilst others are shrinking. And this just points to the complexity when trying to understand and model climate change responses in lakes. This is just another example of the landscape in the Tibetan Plateau, showing how we can have different conditions during past, present, and the future in response to changes in precipitation, evaporation, and snow. So the key thing to consider is that the storage of water in lakes is dependent on this delicate balance of inflow and outflow, so the amount of water that they receive versus the amount of water that they lose. And modeling this is a real challenge in these types of environments in particular, because you have various changing conditions and you need very high resolution models to resolve those changes. Okay, and lastly, I'm just going to talk about some recent work that we've been doing. So I've mentioned throughout this presentation about individual changes in lakes. So for example, changes in ice cover, temperature, water level, and so on, and also talked about extreme events. But some of the work that we've been doing recently and what we hope to push more into in the future is what we call compound extremes. So instead of looking at lakes, lake processes in an individual way, such as heat waves, droughts, floods, or impact of storms, as shown here in panels A through to D, we're starting to look at compound events or sequential compound events in lakes. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but a few examples of compound events include when a lake heat wave at the surface happens at the same time as deoxygenation in deep water. So this means that a lake surface will experience thermal stress, whilst the bottom waters will experience oxygen stress. Panel F shows the combined influence of heat waves, anoxia, and drought. So when lakes reach extreme levels in terms of their temperature, extreme lows in terms of their oxygen, and extreme lows in terms of the volume of water within them. So each of these extremes individually have a big impact on the ecosystems, but they're often correlated with other extremes and often happen at the same time. So the work that we've been doing is trying to understand which lakes are exposed to these concurrent compound extremes and how they will change in the future. And with that, I will stop my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions, or if people have questions afterwards, feel free to email me and I'm happy to interact. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm a plant person, so it was really nice to learn more about the lake systems and how actually complex they are. Fascinating. Thank you. Do we have questions already in the audience?
I could ask, here is Lauri, hi,
Yeah.
about the surface heat wave, and then you mentioned the subsurface heat wave. Are they correlated, or can the subsurface heat wave occur in a irrespective of the surface heat wave?
Yeah, good question. And yes, they can happen irrespective of the surface heat waves. So the heat waves are defined individually for each layer of a lake. So the surface heat waves are defined according to baseline conditions at the surface, whereas the bottom, for example, are defined relative to bottom conditions in the past. So you could have an anomalous bottom temperature and not an anomalous surface temperature. So yeah, they are independent, but sometimes they occur at the same time.
Yeah, Owen, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Iestyn, for a really fascinating seminar and yeah, insight into the actually really detailed and involved work with huge amounts of data processing, I guess, to get at these dynamics of temperature and heat waves in the lakes. Really interesting. Thanks very much. Of course, being an ecologist, I'm interested in the ecological and ecosystem consequences of these changes, and I think you get it. I mean, you get towards that in that direction with these number of no escape days. So I'll ask kind of a compound question, if you like, which is like, how have you parameterized those kind of no escape days? Is it with some kind of species thermal tolerance curves and like that?
So it's a good question. And no, not yet. So we basically just defined them in a statistical sense till now. But what we hope to do is if we have thermal tolerance limits for individual species, then we can actually convert those anomalies in temperature according to those things. But as you'll know, species are, in reality, they respond to more than just temperature. So they respond to things such as oxygen concentrations and light and so on. So doing it in a convincing way is very difficult, at least for us who, I mean, we focus on the physical stuff. So
Well, if you want to talk about it more, I'd be very happy to, because, you know, as ecologists, if we start from the point of we have to know every possible environmental driver that affects a species, we're going to get nowhere. So we have to, I think, take a bit of a pragmatic view on this and justify why temperature is an extremely important ecological driver, and we know it is, and then try and make some progress and make some progress with that. And as you may know, there's huge databases now of temperature performance curves and tolerance curves that could be, I think, coupled with this. Yeah, there's always going to be criticism that we haven't taken into account this, we haven't taken into account that, and so on and so on. But I think trying to make some progress is, and I do believe with temperature it's so important that it would be a useful step forward. So be super interested in talking more about that. And
great, yeah, I'll take you up on that. I'll definitely reach out.
Thanks. Thank you for the talk again.
Are there other questions? Yes, Jody.
Yeah, Iestyn, it was really great. My PhD work was in lakes, and so it was lovely to go back and see some of this. I was wondering, could you go back to the lake subsurface heat wave diagram? I found it really interesting that
This one?
yes, that the number of days at depth increases. And can you talk what is that? What do you think is causing that? Is it due to the stratification?
Yeah, so I have to remind myself of what we wrote in the paper on this, and I'm struggling to remember now. But I think what we said was that the surface conditions they respond very quickly to what's happening in the atmosphere. So if you have a cold spell at the surface, like in the atmosphere, then lakes respond quickly. But in deeper water, they respond much less quickly to atmospheric forcing, so they can have prolonged anomalies.
Okay, yes. And then you got to wait until, right, the mixing to get it all mixed back
and
up.
that's what we see also in panel C. So you have the intensity is higher at the surface because they respond to atmospheric heat waves, whereas in deeper water, they're much less extreme, but prolonged.
Yeah, great. Thanks for walking through that again.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, Cara. And then Emily.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. Very nice talk. I was curious, like, kind of what the future is for these lakes that dry up. Do they go through at least a period where they could be ephemeral and are filled periodically and then dry up seasonally? That just makes them more, this initial shrinkage and drying up makes them more prone to being like ephemeral pools. And if so, if there's anything we can learn about systems where these kind of ephemeral pools already exist to get some insights on what the future of these areas could be. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And to be honest, I don't know. We don't have models yet, or we haven't done it yet, looking at how they will change in the future. So it's very difficult to simulate those changes in the future because they're so complex in terms of how much water will go in versus be lost. So we really don't know. I imagine globally, some lakes will, dry up occasionally and then flood again. Others will stay constant, but whatever happens, it will have a big impact on the biogeochemistry as well as the ecology. It's a big unknown, really. It's one of in terms of the physical lake processes, it's one of the things that we've focused on many things, but one of the things we haven't done is the future modeling of water quantity.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Cheers.
Yeah, Emily.
I think probably because it's kind of a related question, and I think you may have already given the answer, but I'll ask it anyway. Thanks for a super interesting talk. I was wondering in a similar line with the lakes like potentially drying up, and you gave examples of lakes getting larger from glacial melt, but I did wonder if we had much of a handle on how precipitation is going to change in the future. So if there's more evaporation, is the water going to go somewhere else, or is it just as likely that it's going to come back down in the same place? Because presumably it's got to go somewhere. Do we know that yet?
There's a lot of work been done on changes in precipitation, precipitation extremes, but also mean changes in precipitation. And people have tried to relate them to lakes and try to quantify what that will mean in terms of lake storage, but in reality, we need to combine all the components of the water budget to know how they will actually change, because precipitation is just one component. In some lakes, like the glacial lakes, it can be quite small, but in others, it can dominate the variability. So, don't know.
Yeah, Nigel, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, a really nice, fantastic presentation. I was wondering, this is something that also we discussed in the group. Would it be possible to do some space for time in a way, instead of modeling, if you just try to have a trajectory through your database of lakes in a way with more or less the same characteristic, but with warmer, in a way, air temperature and so on. Would that make sense, or how would it compare to what you did?
Yeah, I think I'm understanding the question. The problem with doing what you described is that lakes, especially in terms of what I've described today, they barely respond to one single driver. So they don't respond to just air temperature, just precipitation. It's a complex balance of all of those things. So this is why we use process-based models to take into account all the physical processes and the things that we know are happening and how one driver impacts another and so on. This, I guess, could be what machine learning tries to get towards, but it requires a vast amount of data to train those deep learning approaches.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions in the audience? I actually had one from the very beginning. basically, when you were talking about the GLAST database, you said that you used the satellite-driven data, but at the same time a process-based model. And I didn't get, perhaps I missed, to be able to build this database for the current temperatures. Did you also use the process-based model? And if yes, why the observed data was not enough? Maybe it's a naive question.
No, it's not naive at all. So yeah, so we have satellite data for each of these 90,000 lakes. The satellite data, because this period started in the study started in the 1980s, we used Landsat. One of the key problems with Landsat is the temporal resolution. So you're lucky if you get one observation per month, because you can't see through clouds and these types of things. So if you have 10 observations per year, you're doing quite well. But you miss a lot of the information. Yeah. So we have those limitations with the satellites. And then we looked at using process-based models. But one of the limitations of process-based models is that they need to be calibrated and also validated. So what we did here was we used this process-based model, which was called F-Lake. It's a flake model. And then we calibrated it against the satellite data. So we run the model using meteorological data. And then within the model kind of setup, you have some unknowns. So you don't know what different parameters in the source code should be. So you train the model against your observed data, and then you set the best predictor for those calibration parameters. So that's how we combined both. And then we use our model, or our calibrated model, to simulate from 1980 till the near present. Don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, understood. Thank you so much.